Welcome to Medieval India. Episode 6 Tughlak Rulers of Delhi. As we have seen in the last episode, Ghazi Malik Muhammad bin Tughlak had in 1320, more or less against his own wish, been proclaimed Sultan of Delhi, as the entire old royal family had been slain in the previous 4 years. The founder of that new Tughlak dynasty, the son of a Turkish slave in Balban's household who had married a Jat woman, though old in years, was both energetic and resolute. He at once began to righten, as far as still was possible, the injustice and follies that had been committed in the previous years and months. In spite of the unpopularity it aroused, Tughlak recovered the royal treasure that had been plundered or squandered by Khusro and allayed discontent by his measures for the welfare of his subjects. Tughlak also instituted a new postal service that was far more efficient than any hitherto known in India. The news of the arrival at the mouth of the Indus in 1333 of the Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, author of the celebrated account of his travels round the known civilized world of his time, besides in Western Europe, which was still somewhat of an outlier at that time, reached Delhi by post in 5 days. Yet it involved a distance of between 800 and 900 miles. This fact also speaks volumes for the relative security of the country at the time. The upheaval in Delhi, which had ended the Ghazi rule and had ushered in that of the Tughlaks, gave the new ruler of Varangal, Prataparudra II, the opportunity to declare himself free once again. His example prompted disaffection even in those parts of Maharashtra which were still under the control of the Sultanate. Seeing that more Hindu tributaries were going to revolt if the power of the Sultanate further slackened by even one moment, Ghiyas-ud-Din Tughlak resolved therefore to do away with the Hindu kingdoms of the south one after another, until the sway of Islam would extend from the Hindu Kush to as far as Cape Comorin. He began his great design in 1321 by sending against the kingdom of Varangal an expedition led by his son and nominated successor Ulug Khan. The army that marched as usual by way of Devakiri laid waste the country and began infesting the fortresses with which the countryside was dotted, as soon as it entered Telengana. Prataparudra then retreated and shut himself and his forces up in his well-stocked and strongly fortified capital city of Varangal. The siege that followed dragged on for 6 months, at the end of which there was what pretty much amounted to a mutiny of his own officers in the camp against Ulug Khan, who wanted to pursue the siege while his officers were sick of it. He was finally forced by them into negotiations with Prataparudra. The Hindu monarch agreed to let them all go back in peace, and when the ones who refused had left, He fell upon the remainder of the army under Ulug Khan and compelled it into retreat as well. The army was also not left in peace until Ulug Khan entered into negotiations with the rebel section of his army and succeeded in interposing it between himself and the Varangal forces, so that his further retreat to Devakiri might be unhampered. On his way, however, he met another section of the army which was under the command of Majid Abu Rija, who was engaged in a vain attempt to reduce the fortress at Golkir. Majid was a supporter of Ulug Khan and offered to help him in dealing with his rebel lieutenants. He sent instructions round that chiefs and heads of districts were to attack the rebels, seize them, and send their chiefs to the court of the king. He then accompanied Ulug Khan back to Devakiri. His way of dealing with the rebels proved effective. Some of them fell fighting, others fled or hid themselves, while yet others were caught and sent to Delhi to be executed under the feet of the elephants of the Sultan. Elated by his success against the invader, Prataparudra then dispersed the troops and the provisions he had gathered in his capital, and acted as if he had now secured perpetual immunity from further attacks. But to Ghiyas-ud-Din, the failure of his son in Telengana was but a spur to a further and stronger effort to reduce the country. He sent large reinforcements to Devakiri, and Ulug Khan had soon to lead a second expedition against the Kakatiya kingdom. Bidar, on its western frontier, and several other forts, including Bodan, were captured by the invading troops, and Varangal itself was again infested. Ill-prepared as Prataparudra was now, he held out for 5 months, after which famine compelled him to sue for peace. He delivered himself and his family into the hands of Ulug Khan in 1323, who sent him with a strong escort to Delhi. But he seems to have put an end to his life on the way there. Ulug Khan plundered and devastated Varangal and subjugated the rest of the country by fighting where resistance was offered, but generally by simply accepting the submission of Hindu chieftains in the various localities. Ulug Khan then sent an army into Mabar. That country was conquered and for the first time brought under Delhi's control, and the Pandya king, Parakramadeva, was taken prisoner. Mabar, in fact, was still counted as a province of the Delhi Empire when Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlak made Devakiri his capital in 1326. Ulug Khan led yet another expedition against Jainakar in the Ganga kingdom of Orissa too. Here his aim was not so much to conquer that kingdom as to secure the frontier of Varangal to that side. Thus, at the accession of Muhammad bin Tughlak, considerable portions of the Deccan and of South India had acknowledged the sovereignty of the Delhi Sultanate. Devakiri and Varangal were under the effective control of the imperial officers, and the viceroy was set over distant Mabar, who was charged with consolidating the new conquests and firmly establishing and extending the imperial authority and frontiers. While this campaign was in progress, Tughlak beat off a Mongol incursion and then turned his attention to Bengal, that had become an independent sultanate in 1286, with as capital Lakhnawati. The real Turks, who hated the Khaljis as upstart plebeians, had moved in large numbers to Bengal, whose rulers proudly called themselves the kings of the Turks and the Persians. Unruly spirits from the upcountry, particularly the adherents of the house of Balban, had also sought refuge in Delhi. As they had no opportunities for military expansion westwards, the new sultans of Bengal had focused their energy and resources on subduing the small Hindu principalities in the hills and the jungles that still covered the delta of eastern Bengal and which till then had held their own against Muslim domination. However, in the year 1342, according to the chronicle, certain noblemen came to Delhi from Lakhnavati. They were complaining of the oppressive laws under which they were suffering, and they informed the Sultan of the distress and tyranny under which they, as much as the other Muslims, labored. The Sultan sent Nasir-ud-Din with his adopted son Mahmud Khan, who now was favored more by him than Ulug Khan, and his best general, Bahram Khan, at the head of a select body of troopers. When the imperial troops reached the neighborhood of Lakhnavati, the Sultan of Bengal, Ghiyas-ud-Din Bahadur, came out of the town and a savage fight ensued. However, when the soldiers of the Sultan, as the chronicle says, quote, pressed the Bengal army so hard that Bahadur's army was thrown into confusion, Bahadur found no alternative than retreat. And when he was retracing his steps, the imperial troopers with drawn swords charged and spread carnage and terror in the ranks. Bahadur, during the confusion of that fight, remembered that his heart-ravishing concubine of silvery complexion and rosy cheeks was in his tent, and Bahadur turned his face towards his camp, for taking away with himself that moon-faced one to Lakhnavati. The Tughlak troops then pursued him like crocodiles, as the chronicle says, and he was taken prisoner. Tughlak Khan confirmed Sultan Nasir-ud-Din in the government of North Bengal with its capital at Lakhnavati. Eastern Bengal and Southern Bengal, with the capitals respectively at Sonargaon and Satgaon, were annexed to the empire, and Bahram Khan was appointed to govern them. Tughlak, following the example of the other founders of dynasties at Delhi, has left a monument of his reign in his fortress capital of Daulatabad, which he built for himself on a rocky eminence nearly 10 miles to the south of the site afterwards selected by Shah Jahan for his new city. That is nowadays Old Delhi. He founded his town immediately on his ascent to the throne and completed it before he received the news of the conquest of Telengana. Ibn Battuta writing. Here, writes Ibn Battuta, were Tughlak's treasures and palaces, and the great palace which he had built of gilded bricks, which, when the sun rose, shone so dazzlingly that none could gaze steadily upon it. There he laid up great treasures, and it was related that he constructed there a cistern and had molten gold poured into it, so that it became one solid mass. End quote. On his return to Tughlakabad from Bengal, it was elaborately decorated, and Ulug Khan prepared a welcome for his father by building for his reception a temporary kiosk, where he might take rest and refreshments after his toilsome journey and before his grand entry into the capital. According to Ibn Battuta, but I should emphasize the chronicle the chronicles are not very clear on this point, Ulug Khan caused this building, which was of wood, to be erected to his own design. According to Ibn Battuta then, it was so designed as to collapse when elephants pushed one corner. Ulug Khan welcomed his father at the kiosk, entertained him for a meal, at the conclusion of which he begged that the elephants captured in Bengal might be paraded and raced round the building. His father acceded to his request, and according to Ibn Battuta, one of them then came into contact with that part of the building which had been designed to effect the collapse of the whole. The whole building then fell on the old king and it crushed him. Diggers were summoned, but their arrival was purposely delayed according to Ibn Battuta, and the king's body was finally discovered when all the debris was removed. It bent over that of his favorite son Muhammad Khan as though to protect him. Historians have long had different views about this. It has been suggested the kiosk might have been struck by lightning, and more likely that it was only a flimsy construction that could not suffer the vibrations of lots of people and stamping elephants added to that. Personally, that seems to me the most likely explanation. Ulug Khan ascended the throne of Delhi in 1325 with the title Muhammad Shah. There are kings in history who have been overwhelmed and their reputation tarnished by undeserved ill fortune. But Muhammad Shah Tughlak was not one of them. If he was eventually overwhelmed by rebellions against his rule, then this was due to his contradictory character itself. According to the chronicle, quote, Sultan Muhammad planned in his own breast 3 or 4 projects by which the whole of the habitable world was to be brought under the rule of his servants. But he never talked over these projects with any of his counselors or friends. Whatever he conceived, he considered to be good. But in promulgating and enforcing his schemes for conquest, he lost his hold upon the territories he already possessed. He disgusted his own people and he emptied his treasury. Great men came to him with insinuating proposals and deceitful representations, and as far as they knew how or were able to, they robbed the throne of its wealth in that way. The coveted countries were never acquired, but those which he possessed were lost, while his treasure, which is the true source of political power, was expended in vain. End quote. Muhammad was, by the terms of his time, unlike Alauddin Khalji, a man of culture, learning, and of virtue. The Sultan was described as generous and liberal with his money, and with all his munificence, yet he could be full of humility too. Says one chronicle, quote, At the funeral of a fakir of great sanctity, he bore the coffin on his shoulders. He was noted for knowing the holy book by heart, as he also did the law book called lndia, which expounds the principles of the school of Abu Hanifa. He excelled in all intellectual accomplishments, and possessed to the very highest degree a talent for calligraphy. He was given to religious exercises and careful to always regulate his passions. To these advantages he added literary acquirements. He was fond of reciting verses, of composing verses and hearing them read, where he readily seized their most hidden allusions. He liked to consult with learned men and to converse with men of merit. He was also particularly fond of contending with poets in Persian, a language which he knew perfectly and understood all its subtleties of expression. And yet, there's another chronicle, precisely because of this quote, the dogmas of the philosophers, which are productive of indifference and hardiness of heart, had a profound influence over him. But the declarations of the Holy Book and the utterance of the Prophet, which inculcate benevolence and humility, and hold out the prospect of future punishment, he deemed not worthy of attention. The punishment of Muslims and the execution of true believers with him became a practice and a passion. Numbers of doctors and elders and sayyids and Sufis and clerks and soldiers received punishment at his orders. Not a day or week passed without the spilling of much Muslim blood and the running of streams of gore before the entrance of his palace. End quote. Even such a favored foreigner as Ibn Battuta found that his life was twice in danger. And yet, terrified as he was for him, he was still sickened by the daily spectacle of the king's cruelty as he came to the palace. Many a time, he writes, I saw the bodies of the slain at his gate, thrown there. One day my horse shied under me, and I saw something white on the ground, and asked what it was. And my companions told me that it was the breast of a man who had been cut into 3 pieces. The king slew both small and great, and spared not the learned, the pious or the noble. Daily there were brought to the council hall men in chains, fetters and bonds, and they were led away, some to executions, some to tortures, and some to scourging. On every day, except Friday, there was a coal delivery. But on Friday the prisoners were not let out, and it was on that day only that they took their ease and cleansed themselves. End quote. Muhammad Tughlak explained his motives as follows, quote, In my days, many wicked and turbulent men are to be found. I visit them with chastisement upon the suspicion or presumption of their rebellious and treacherous designs, and I punish the most trifling act of contumacy with death. This I will have to do until I die, or until the people finally act honestly and give up thinking of rebellion and contumacy. I have no such vizier as will make rules to obviate my shedding blood. I punish people because they have all at once become my enemies and opponents. I have dispensed great wealth among them, but they have not become friendly and loyal to me. Their temper is only too well known to me, and I see that they are still disaffected and inimical. If I could settle the affairs of my kingdom according to my wish, he would further say, I would consign my realm of Delhi to 3 persons, to Firuz Shah, to Malik Kabir, and Ahmed Ajaz, and I would then proceed on the pilgrimage to the Holy Temple at Mecca. But at present I am angry with my subjects, and they are aggrieved with me. The people are acquainted with my feelings, and I am aware of their misery and wretchedness. No treatment that I employ is of any benefit. My remedy for the rebels, insurgents, opponents and disaffected people is the sword. I employ punishment and use of the sword so that a cure may be effected by suffering. The more the people resist, the more I inflict chastisement. Tughlak was a brave and energetic soldier too, and yet his military operations, just as his administrative measures, were at times brilliant and at others they were acts of a madman. In 1327, the second year of Muhammad's reign, the king's cousin, Bahauddin Khurshab, rose in revolt, and the rebellion spread throughout the Deccan before it was crushed. Khurshab then took refuge with the Raja of Kampili, who beat off the first attack made by Muhammad's troops. But on the arrival of reinforcements, the fall of the place became certain. The Raja of Kampili, no longer able to protect his guest, sent him on to Viraballa III of Hoysala for sanctuary, and then, after the women had all perished in the reed of Jauhar, he led out his fighting men to meet a Rajput there. Viraballa, however, weakly surrendered Khurshab. He was taken to Devakiri, where Muhammad flayed and roasted him alive, sent his cooked flesh to his family, and after stuffing his skin with straw, exhibited the loathsome trophy in all the chief cities of his kingdom. During his stay at Devakir, Muhammad had the by itself reasonable idea of establishing a more central seat of government, and he decreed that Devakiri, which he named Daulatabad, should be the new capital. Not only the great officers of state and the courtiers, but apparently also all provincial governors were commanded to build for themselves houses at Daulatabad, to send their families there, and to make it their home. The king spared pains nor expenses to beautify his capital and to make it a worthy substitute of Delhi. Spacious bazaars were laid out and handsome buildings erected, and Ibn Battuta, who visited Daulatabad several years later, described it as a great and magnificent city, fully equal of Delhi. However, the king's greatest work was the marvelous citadel, the ancient stronghold of the Rajas of Devakiri, which was much strengthened and improved by him. The fort, as Muhammad left it, was described as follows 3 centuries later by Abdul Hamid Lahouri, the official chronicler of Shah Jahan's reign. Quote, "This lofty fortress, the ancient names of which were Devakiri and Daharigir, and which is now known as Daulatabad, is a mass of rock which raises its head towards the heavens. The rock has been scarped throughout its circumference, which measured 5,000 legal yards to a depth which ensures the retention of water in the ditch at the foot of the escarpment. The escarpment is so smooth and even that neither an ant nor a snake would be able to scale it." End quote. With Daulatabad as his base, Muhammad restored order in the Deccan, only to learn that Multan and Sindh were now in revolt, a rising which was crushed with equal success. During the first 4 years of his reign, Muhammad's ruthless cruelty had been generally aimed at individuals, not all of whom were guilty, although at the taking of Multan, only the prayers of Sheikh Rukn-ud-Din had prevented a general massacre of the inhabitants. But in 1329, Muhammad inflicted upon his people the first of those wholesale vindictive punishments which eventually led to the dismemberment of the sultanate. Muhammad came back to stay in Delhi after the repulse of a Mongol incursion, to find himself highly unpopular with the Delhi inhabitants, who had been almost ruined by the removal of the court to Daulatabad. The citizens showed their discontent by throwing anonymous letters of abuse into the audience hall at night. The king then replied by issuing a decree that every soul was to leave Delhi, a city of 10 miles across, including its suburbs, and go to Daulatabad, more than 600 miles away. The city, with its adjacent suburbs and villages, spread over 4 or 5 kos. It was one of the great cities of Islam and the most noble one after Cairo. And, says Ibn Battuta, The orders were so strictly carried out that, quote, when the emperor's servants searched the city after the removal and found one blind man in one of the houses and another one bedridden, the bedridden man was projected from a catapult and the blind one dragged by his feet to Daulatabad. But the latter limbs dropped off on the way, and at the end of the journey only one leg was left that was duly thrown into Daulatabad. All the buildings of Delhi were destroyed. So complete was the ruin that not a cat or a dog was left amongst the buildings of the city, in its palaces or in its suburbs. Everybody was forced to move. The people, who for so many years and for so many generations had been natives and inhabitants of the land, were broken-hearted, says the chronicle. Many, from the toils of the long journey, perished on the road, and those who arrived at Daulatabad could not endure the pain of exile. In despondency they pined to death. All around Devakir, which is an infidel land, there sprung up graveyards of Muslims. End quote. The Sultan was admittedly bounteous in his liberality and favors to the immigrants, both on their journeys and on their arrival. But many of them were of tender constitution, and they could not endure this exile and the sufferings during the journey. In the first year of his reign, Muhammad had caused a register of revenue and expenditure to be made by all the provincial governments, apparently to establish a uniform assessment. But in 1330 he introduced into the Doab new and heavy taxation, partly to replenish a depleted treasury with the expensive construction project at Daulatabad, but chiefly to punish the turbulent and disaffected Hindus living in one of the richest and most fertile provinces, most of which, as I said in an earlier episode, were crown lands, the core of the Sultanate. The taxation was at least doubled, and the peasants, being quite unable to meet those demands, fled to the jungle, took to brigandage, and rebelled. The countryside was ravaged, and by 1333 a state of war existed in the Doab and Kannauj. About the year 1329, in order to raise more money, Muhammad tried the expedient of a token currency. The idea of substituting paper for a metal token currency was not a new one. Paper money was used in Mongol China with suitable precautions, and in Persia, during the rule of the Ilkhans, token currencies had been circulating too. A new currency might have stopped a major problem in India, namely the periodic lack of gold or silver currencies, which often stopped transactions and trade and might even seriously impede taxation. But Muhammad believed that by a simple decree he could make copper tokens pass current at the same rate as gold and silver coins. The king failed to realize the ease with which counterfeit tokens could be made. In 4 years the entire scheme collapsed under mountains of false tokens, and Muhammad, to his credit be it said, recalled the expensive issue, and although it was impossible to distinguish the counterfeit from the genuine, paid for the tokens presented at the treasury in good money. The gold tangda had risen to the value of 100 copper tokens, and the king's subjects for once made a good thing out of a government whose farming of the provincial and district taxes was already a scandal which was growing into a major revolt. The rest of the tale of Muhammad's reign is one of unbroken and irreparable disaster. In the madness of his dreams of world conquest, Muhammad resolved to conquer China through Tibet. and in the year 1337 he sent an army of 100,000 cavalry and a strong force of infantry under Malik Nakpia, who held the honorary post of chief of the insignia bearers to Tibet. The chronicle pursues, quote, "They took the town of Judea, situated at the foot of the mountains, and the places adjacent. They made prisoners, they plundered and they burned. The infidels fled to the heights of the mountains. They abandoned their country, their flock, and the treasures of their kings. But only one road led into the mountains. Below lays a valley, above the mountains, and the horsemen can only pass by it one by one. The troops of the Sultan ascended by this road and took possession of the town of Warangal in the upper part of the mountains. They seized upon everything it contained, and they wrote to the sovereign, informing him of their victory. When the great rains came, the army was attacked by disease, which considerably weakened it. The horses died, and the bows grew slack, and so the emirs sought permission from the Sultan to leave the mountains during the rainy season, to descend to the base, and to again take up their position when the rain had ceased. The Sultan consented. So the commander, Nakpia, took all the property he had secured, whether provisions, metals or precious stones, and distributed them amongst the troops, to carry them to the bottom of the mountain. But when the infidels found out that the Muslims were retreating, they waited for them in the gorges of the mountains and occupied the defiles before them. They cut down old trees and cast them from the heights of the mountains. And these killed all with whom they came in contact. The greatest part of the men perished, the rest were taken prisoners. The Hindus seized treasures, merchandise, horses and arms. Of all the Muslims, finally only 3 chiefs escaped." End quote. This catastrophe, in which the largest and best army of the Sultanate and a huge amount of treasure was lost, shook the empire to its very foundation, and rebellion now broke out everywhere against Muhammad's tyranny throughout all the 23 provinces of the Delhi Empire. Whenever and wherever Muhammad marched to subdue his subjects in one part, in another part of the empire rebellion would flame up. Eastern and Western Bengal had both successfully asserted their independence, to be finally united in one kingdom by Malik Ilyas in 1352. To the evils of civil war, which Muhammad tried in vain to end by frightfulness, were added the horrors of a famine in which the people of northern India were finally reduced to eating human flesh. And all that just at the time that Muhammad had revoked his decree and people were coming back from Daulatabad to Delhi. The king took prompt and energetic measures for relief, giving a daily issue of grain and cooked foods to the victims and advancing large sums to the peasants for seed corn, stock and necessary improvements. Partly on account of official dishonesty, the loans were not a success, and Muhammad visited the failure upon his starving subjects with his orgy of executions. Something still had to be done, however, for the starving people of Delhi, and Muhammad once more ordered the evacuation of the city, this time, however, for its subjects' good. In 1336, he built a town of Booth, 165 miles away at Sarkatwari, and these huts were replaced in the following year by more permanent buildings. Here, supplied from the fertile province of Awad, which had remained prosperous under the wise and kindly rule of its governor Ain-ul-Mulk, the Delhi colony remained for 6 years. With pardonable exaggeration, Muslim historians included the whole of the Deccan and South India in the Empire of Delhi in this period. They divided it into the 5 provinces of Devakiri, Teleng, Kampili, Dora Samudra and Mabar, some adding Jatnagar, Orissa as a 6th one, although there is no justification for this at all. Each of these provinces had a governor set over it who was assisted by a military coadjutor in charge of the provincial army and a kotwal who policed the capital of the province. Except in Devakiri, however, the power of the Sultan was nowhere firmly established. Dora Samudra, for example, owed nothing more than a mere nominal allegiance to the Sultanate, and the masses, especially in the rural areas, were not reconciled to the new rule at all. The introduction of the Iqta system, by which the land was parcelled out among Muslim chieftains who had to maintain a quota of troops and pay a stipulated amount to the treasury, did not make for any peace or smooth administration, as it went entirely contrary to the hollow system of rule by rural caste assemblies that the Pandyas and the Cholas had used in their time. This entire loose fabric crumbled quickly at the revolt which came naturally not long after. By 1331, the entire coastal region of the Tamil country had been cleared from the Muslims, and Hindu chieftains had recommenced to restore and reconstruct the civic order on its old lines. At the same time, Somadeva, who claimed descent from the ancient line of the Chalukyas and became the progenitor of the later Aryavadu kings of Vijayanagar, led the Hindus of the western Telugu country in revolt against their Muslim overlord Malik Muhammad, governor of Kampili. As the Hoysala king Balala III had also thrown off his allegiance to the Sultan and had invaded the province of Kampili, Malik Muhammad was helpless. He wrote the Sultan, as the Portuguese author Pedro Nunes later on recorded in his history of Vijayanagar, that the land had risen against him, and that everyone was lord of what he pleased, and no one was on his side. While the people came to besiege him in the fortress, allowing no provisions to go into his place, nor paying him the taxes that had been forced on them. End quote. Jalauddin Hasan Shah, the governor of Mabar, meanwhile, had asserted his independence after doing away with the local lieutenants of the Sultan, and he began to issue gold and silver coins in his own name from his new capital at Madurai in 1333. Muhammad Tughlak got news of the revolt and intended to march to Warangal, where the outbreak of an epidemic, however, decimated his army, and the Sultan himself caught the infection as well. He therefore had to retrace his steps, having achieved nothing except destroying what remained of the prestige of the Delhi Sultanate in the south. A false rumor that the Sultan had died of the plague added to the confusion, and the rebels, both Hindu and Muslims, felt greatly hurt. But the critical blow to the empire that had spent nearly all of India and that Muhammad Tughlak had inherited from Alauddin Khalji fell in 1347. The numerous Persian and Turkish officials of the revenue department in the province of Daulatabad fell under suspicion of the Sultan because they had failed to collect the enormous revenue which they were required to have yielded. These Amir of 100, as their official designation was, or the centurions, as the British colonial historians like to call them, were always ready with the Roman word, were sent under escort by the governor of Daulatabad to Broos, in accordance with the Sultan's orders. But news of the Sultan's slaughtering the centurions in the neighboring province of Malwa had reached them, and they were clearly not willing to submit tamely to something like that. They therefore revolted at the end of the first day's march to Broos. They returned to Daulatabad, imprisoned its weak governor, and proclaimed one of themselves, Ismail Mulk, an Afghan, to the king of the Deccan, under the title Nasir-ud-Din Shah. An imperial army, led by Muhammad himself, soon made its appearance on the scene from Broos, defeated the rebels, and they shut themselves up in the citadel of Daulatabad. But some, including Ismail Mulk's brothers, managed to escape to Gulbarga under the leadership of Hassan Kangu alias Safar Khan. After 3 months, Hassan had gathered a considerable army, including contingents from Kapaya Nayaka of Warangal, and he marched to Bidar. Meanwhile, Muhammad had been called away by a rebellion in Gujarat, and Hassan easily defeated and dispersed the remaining imperial army after slaying their commanders. As he approached Daulatabad, the royal troops raised the siege, and they rapidly retired to Malwa. The aged and ease-loving Nasir-ud-Din Shah, the new king of the Deccan, readily abdicated his troublesome charge in favor of Hassan, who proclaimed himself ruler on 3 August 1347 under the name Sultan Abdul Muzaffar Alauddin Bahman Shah. He was the founder of the Bahmani dynasty, whose fortunes we shall trace later on. The news of that disaster reached Muhammad when he was putting down a rebellion in Gujarat and Kathiawar, and giving up all hopes of recovering the Deccan, he rapidly proceeded to restore order in his western provinces. But in March 1351 he died of fever in Sindh, and the king was freed from his people and they from their king, a king who had lavished almost untold wealth upon the foreigners who visited his country, but who had, in his own words to Barney, looked upon his subjects as his natural enemies, and the penal laws as a means of visiting his personal displeasures on them. We shall consider the reign of his successor, who was in any way the precise opposite of Muhammad, and then consider the likely greatest man-made disaster that ever befell India, the invasion of Tamerlane, in the next episode.